All right, today at Happy Fly Fishing, we're gonna be discussing what side of the United States is best for the fly fishermen. Is it the East Coast or West Coast? Both East and West have their cons, both have their pros, but at the end of the video, we're just gonna discuss them for what they are, and we're gonna figure out what side is better, the East Coast or West Coast. Now, this is just from my experience and also from the experience of people that I've spoken with out west and some of the guys that I've interacted with over my short career as a fly fisherman. So I'll kind of break it down for you. I'm going to be considering everything from west of the Mississippi over the western half of the United States, and then everything from the east of that, the eastern side of the United States. Okay, so starting with the East Coast. For one, you have a huge diversity of fish. You have all different species of bass. You have bowfin, pike, muskie, gar, carp, shad even. And then considering the coastline, you can even fish for redfish, tarpon, tuna, skipjack, bluefish, redfish, black drum. There's really a whole array of different species that you can find on the East Coast that you can't find on the West Coast. So just for an example here, currently I'm living in Georgia, and I can drive about 3 hours north and be in the middle of trout country. Then I can drive in another 3 hours north and fly fish for pike and muskie. And then I can drive 6 hours to the coast and I can fish for redfish and tuna the next morning. So there's a lot of variety here, and you can't really get that kind of variety out west necessarily. Pro number two, there's a lot of water on the East Coast. There's lakes, rivers, creeks, streams, and they all hold different species of fish. There's tons of water here. It's all really accessible. There's plenty of roads and county roads that you can find that take you to these places. So it's not hard to find places to fish. Pro number three, access is not as difficult as it is out west. There are some areas that I fished that you would literally need a 4x4 to get down to fish these little creeks and streams, and the only reason that I was able to fish them is because I was stupid enough to drive my car down to them. I would not suggest that, because had I gotten a flat or bottomed the car out, I would not have been coming out there without any help. Pro number four, there's also a lot of public access in Georgia and the East Coast for that matter that a lot of people don't know about. On the East Coast, there's a lot of public land that nobody really utilizes. Especially not other fly fishermen, so you're probably not going to see 15 drift boats coming down the river while you're out fly fishing. You may see one other person the entire year fly fishing in Georgia for that matter. Oh, and pro number five, you can literally fish year-round. The waters don't freeze over. Half of our entire species are just warm water species that you can find practically anywhere in the States. But for the most part, the waters are not going to ice over. You're going to have plenty of waters to fish, either for warm waters, or you can go up north and do trout. All right, con number one of fly fishing on the East Coast. You have a lot of diversity of fish, but if you're a fly fisherman, you know, trout are kind of the bread and butter. The trout fishing in Georgia, for example, just sucks. It's better in other places. You know, if you drive to Maine, Tennessee, and Kentucky has some decent fly fishing for trout, North Carolina, South Carolina, but it's not the same as it is out west. You don't necessarily have the same big bug patterns that you can throw like hoppers, and a lot of the fish are significantly smaller unless you just stick with streamer fishing, which is kind of one of my favorite things to do. Con number two, despite the large amount of water being present on the East Coast, it's really hard to access it without a boat. So me personally, I have a kayak that I take with me almost anywhere I go, and I usually put it in when I'm fishing for warm water species. Anytime I'm down at the coast, I'll bring it with me. It's a good way to get around, but unless you have a kayak, or any vessel for that matter, you are really limited in your options to fish. On the East Coast at least, you don't necessarily have the same protections of wading that you would out west on some of those rivers. All right, so for my next con about fly fishing on the East Coast, so despite there being a lot of public lands on the East Coast, it's really heavily used because there's such a huge population here. You can have a raft of float tubers come by on the river, kayakers, boaters, water skiers, jet skiers, and that can really mess your day up, especially if you're on some of the big lakes targeting striped bass and stuff. It's not fun to have a flotilla of jet skis just blow right through you. All right, so now that we've done the East Coast, let's talk about the West Coast a little bit. Obviously, the first pro that I'm gonna talk about here is the trout. The trout fishing is to die for. Now, I understand that there's other species you can go after, especially if you get over into California or other places. You know, you can fish the coast, you can fish for largemouth bass in some places. I know there's even striped bass there, but it's not quite the same populations that you would find on the East Coast. However, for the most part, you're pretty limited to trout. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That's one of the biggest pros on here is you have great trout fishing. Pro number 2, there's a lot less people in the western half of the United States compared to the eastern half of the United States. And that kind of frees up a lot of the waters you're fishing. Now, that being said, we'll talk about this in a con later, you're gonna see a few more people because they're out there specifically fly fishing and taking in the outdoors. Pro number 3, wade access laws are such a huge thing out there. I know that this doesn't go for every state, but for the most part, you can get out of your boat or you can hop out from a bridge somewhere, anywhere there's access to a river and start fly fishing. And if the landowner says anything to you, well, you have the high water mark. And as long as you stay below the high water mark, in most places, you'll be fine. Now, you should always look up your state regulations and laws before you go fly fishing anywhere and just wading out into some river just to make sure you're not trespassing. And for my last pro here, we'll talk about the scenery. God, the western half of the United States is beautiful and nothing matches it. You can see for miles, you can go backpacking to alpine lakes and not see a single soul. You can spend days on the river and not even see a single person fly fishing, and it'll just be you enjoying the wonderful scenery out there. All right, and so for my list of cons, I'll keep it short because there's not a lot, but they are pretty significant. Con number 1, there's not a lot of diversity for different species of fish. You're gonna have trout, and that's just about it. Now again, if that's your thing, great, go for it. But you're not gonna be able to fish for a whole lot of other species like you would find here in Georgia or any other eastern state for that matter. Con number 2, a lot of places tend to ice over in the wintertime, which means you're either gonna be skiing or snowboarding, or you are gonna be ice fishing, or going down to Florida and fishing the coast somewhere. So if you can deal with that and you don't mind packing up your fly rods for the year and just waiting it out till the next season, that place is for you. Me personally, I really enjoy fishing throughout the year. Not that you can't really do that out west, but your options get really limited because everything's frozen over. And for my last con here, it's gotta be just the atmosphere of fly fishing out west. You run into a lot of people on the river. I mean, if you go fish the Madison, for example, you can see 15 or 20 drift boats right behind you on a single day, all following the same line going down the river. If you don't mind seeing 15 or 20 other drift boats on the same river as you, then go for it. But one of the reasons that I go fly fishing is because I don't really want to see a whole lot of people out on the river. I would rather go fish some small isolated stream that's 5 miles up in the mountains than fish down low on the plateaus and the flat plains where there's 15 or 20 other people fishing the same area that I am. All right, so that concludes the pros and cons of both East and West. We'll compare the two now and talk about which one's better. So obviously the East Coast is going to win the diversity rule because you just have so much you can fish for. And if you're anything like me, I love fishing warm water. I enjoy fishing for trout as well. I also enjoy fishing the coast. So I get a whole lot of different species. You have the opportunities there on the West Coast, but they're just not nearly as diverse as they are on the East Coast. So this round goes to the East Coast. Secondly, public lands. They're about even as far as the West Coast and East Coast. Now, the West Coast obviously is much prettier. You have much more scenic areas, mountainous terrain. But you know, the East Coast, you have some really forested areas. You have some pretty mountains, especially up through Tennessee and North Carolina. So we're just gonna call it even on that one. All right, next we'll do access. And I can't really speak for the entirety of the West Coast or East Coast, but it's pretty limited depending on where you go. The West Coast tends to have a lot more leg room where you can get out, walk around, and go fish the streams that you want to go fish, while the East Coast, you really have to have a boat or some other vessel to fish the places you want. So I'll give this round to the West Coast. All right, next up we'll compare access to streams. So obviously you can get to places a lot easier on the East Coast than you can on the West Coast. Most places on the East Coast, you don't need a four-wheel drive. You can get to them in your car. Makes it a lot easier. However, you do have to deal with the public once you get there. And for the final round, we'll talk about fishing throughout the year. Obviously, on the East Coast, you can fish throughout the year for the most part because most places do not freeze over in the wintertime. So, final round goes to the East Coast, and we'll just say the East Coast is better for fly fishing. If I'm wrong, feel free to argue with me, but like I said, if you're a trout guy, the West is the best for you. If you're really just worried about fly fishing in general and you don't mind what you're catching just as long as it's a fish, then the East Coast is for you because you have so many different species you can target in a given week. I'm gonna do a channel update real quick too. I'm back in Georgia obviously because I'm talking about Georgia. I'll be doing some videos here on the East Coast. I'm not gonna tell you where yet, but I will be down really far south for a little bit. We'll be doing some saltwater fishing, and then I'll be back up north in the Carolinas region doing some fly fishing up through there and doing some backpacking. So I'm really excited to do some saltwater fly fishing because it's only like the 4th time that I've done it, but we've had some warm weather push in. It seems like the fish are really turning on down there. So we'll be going for redfish, tarpon, snook, whatever takes a fly. And then once I get back to Georgia, we'll be up in the mountains. I'll do a solo backpacking trip for about 3 or 4 days. Really looking forward to it. So if you guys want to see the content, make sure you stick around the channel, give me a thumbs up. And if I missed something in the video or you think I left something out, or if I'm wrong, please leave a comment. I'll get to you, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Till then.